show that discusses internal and relational anxiety, how it blocks effective leadership, and how we can move through it to a greater health. And now your host, Steve Cuss.
Hello there, fellow pilgrims. Welcome to another episode. Today's guest, I'm really excited about it. It's Father Gregory Boyle. Father G really doesn't need any introduction, but in case you are not familiar with his work, he's the founder of Homeboy Industries, which is the largest gang intervention program in the world. Father G is a Jesuit priest who moved into East LA in the early 1980s. He founded Homeboy in 1988. And let me just say before we get to the interview that I caught Father G at home, and he was kind enough to chat with me on the phone, and my audio capturing technology did not play nice with his phone at all. So I'm sorry to say that the quality of the audio is really rough, but oh my goodness, the quality of what Father G has to say I would describe as essential listening. So if you're having trouble hearing it, I'm going to be posting a whole bunch of memes on Twitter and Facebook, just sharing some of the quotes, because I think Father G just had gold for all of us. So I began the interview just asking him about Homeboy Industries and what he's excited about now and what their focus is on nowadays.
Well, I think we moved from being probably our first 15 years being job-centric, mainly because gang members said, along with the school, which was the first thing we did, they said if only we had jobs. So, that became our motto. Nothing stops a bullet like a job. And then we made this shift. We still employ and pay people to be trained, etc. But what shifted was now we're solidly healing centered, and I think the shift comes from beginning by listening to gang members. But then 15 years in, once the depth of knowledge of who gang members are and what they have to deal with, it was abundantly clear that healing needed to be center stage. And so that's kind of where we are now.
And do you have a particular favorite modality for healing?
Well, I think the secret sauce for Homeboy really is this community of tenderness that trumps gang, but it also is more powerful than any union or supposed union they had experienced with their gang, and often more deep and pervasive than their experience of family. So that the context is everything. A lot of programs want to they think content is what is so essential. So they have, their 10-point plan, and here's our curriculum, and here's where this population needs to measure up to. And yet we do have content, but context, which is the community of tenderness, is the more important thing, and its content is really secondary to it. So that's kind of our essential piece, that somehow that's our modality, which is tenderness, is what we would say. And that once people, this does all the things that you want to have done. It sort of disarms them. It enables them to fully surrender to their own healing, to cooperate, with the work that needs to be done. And then they can gain resilience. They can re-identify who they are. They can really actively repair attachment, and all those things happen. And then they are newly resilient. They leave us after 18 months, and now the world will throw at them what it will. But the difference now is they won't be toppled by it.
You frequently use two words that I think I guess I'd say they're gospel-soaked. You talk a lot about kinship and mutuality. Would you mind telling us a bit about what you mean by those words?
Well, you get into a danger with service, so service is, I'll acknowledge that maybe that's where you begin. The problem is we settle for service. We end at service. But service is the hallway that gets you to the ballroom, which is the place of connection and exquisite mutuality and kinship. So that's where we're going. And Otherwise, there's distance, service provider, service recipient. There's distance in that, and you want it to be always mutual. So, biblically, you have this notion that God says, as I have loved you, so must you have a special preferential care and love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger. And God identifies these folks as the ones who know what it's like to have been cut off, and because they've suffered in exactly this way, God thinks these are the folks who happen to be our trustworthy guides. So you don't go to the margins to make a difference. You go to the margins so that the widow, orphan, and the stranger make you different. So that's how I think we're meant to turn this whole thing on its head. And that's when you arrive at mutuality. There is no us and them. There's just us. There is no daylight that separates us. You obliterate the illusion that we are separate. And this is God's dream come true, which is kinship, that you may be one. And that's the goal. Otherwise, if it's I'm going to the margins to make a difference, well, how is that not about you? And it can't be about you. And even practically, this is why people burn out, is because it's about them. That's why they get depleted, not because of compassion fatigue. They burn out because they're doing it incorrectly, and their focus is quite off. So anyway, I think all these notions need to be turned on its head. Otherwise, we get stumped by it, and then we walk away from it. And that's why mutuality is so compelling and rich.
There's so much you just said, Father G, that I'd love to take in a couple of different directions. The first one is when you mentioned the preferential option for the poor, or God's preference to where it's on the margins that all of us discover God. I'm a suburban Australian, and I remember in seminary my New Testament professor was from Ethiopia. And the first day of class, he said, I tell you what you don't need another book written by a white guy. And he then proceeded to expose us to a depth and breadth of liberation theology, including in my own tradition in Australia, Aboriginal liberation theology. It sounds like you've been somewhat informed by that as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think we tend to disqualify ourselves. This is an odd thing that I'm experiencing, especially in Jesuit universities. I get a lot of talks, and there's this notion that, it's kind of the white privilege, but it's also privilege, even if you're a person of color and you're privileged, that there's a privilege paralysis, where students in particular just feel like, who am I to go to the margins, isn't this disrespectful to even go to the margins? And again, what undergirds that is the notion that, well, yeah, if you're going to the margins to fix and, save, then, and obviously it's about you, if that's how you see it. A woman in Chicago, after a talk, a senior at a university, said, I'm afraid to go to the margins. I said, why are you afraid? And she said, because I'm afraid I won't fit in. And I said, as long as it's about you, you will always be afraid. And I think, and that was kind of a frog that leapt out of my mouth, and I went, oh my God, why did I just say that? But I think it's true. I think we disqualify ourselves. We say, I couldn't possibly go to the margins because I'm not from the margins. I'm not a person of color. I'm not poor. I'm not a gang member. I'm not a former heroin addict. Whatever the list is, but these are all lists that remove us from the fact that if you're a proud owner of a pulse, you can go to the margins. And this isn't about qualifications. If you're going to the margins to save, rescue, and fix people, okay, I get your point. But if you're going to the margins so that you can be reached by folks at the marches. Well, now we're talking something different. If you're going there to receive people, so that mutually everybody inhabits their own, unshakable goodness and dignity and nobility, well, then that's a different thing. Plus, that's endlessly replenishing. You'll never experience depletion if that's your mindset.
Did you come to East LA with this mindset, Father G, or was this mindset cultivated in you over time?
Well, definitely cultivated, because, I'm sure I spent the first 6 years working with gang members as truly, all about depletion and exhaustion, and I suspect it was all about me. I'd be, on my bike in the middle of the night, and hey, put that Uzi down. Are you sure you want to shoot that guy? And then I kind of, the light switch was turned on where I went, no, this is completely wrong. And it's like a conversation I had with a former gang member who is working with gang members in Houston, and he kind of, after a talk, pleaded with me. He said, how do you reach them? Meaning gang members. And again, I found myself saying, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? Now that feels like it's passive, or I don't know what it feels like. All I know is that that's what it looks like when we turn this on its head. And that's when kinship gets ushered in, is when you can actually pull that off. And so somewhere, in the 6th to 8th year of my 35 years of doing this, that's when I kind of said, oh, okay, I'm doing this incorrectly. And it literally was like a light switch. It just turned on, and I've never turned it off.
Yeah.
And though I do, I'll admit I get tired and exhausted, but I've never felt depleted since then. I've never felt like I just can't go on, that kind of thing. The kind of thing, burnout, I suppose, is what it's called. I've never felt near that in the last, 25 years, I guess.
Yeah, because if kinship and solidarity is your target, if that's what progress looks like, or however you want to frame that, you're always accomplishing it.
Yeah, I think so. And then it's, again, eternally replenishing. It becomes like this well of water that's fresh and renewing, And it never gets stale, because then, I think there are more elements to that. But essentially, if you can make sure it's not about you, then that's where the joy is. This is why we're invited to the margin. Not because it's a grim duty. It isn't. Jesus would maintain that this is where the joy is. This is why I'm inviting you there. My joy, yours, your joy complete. But we think it's like, the harder thing is the better thing. And it isn't. The harder thing is just the harder thing to deal. But we want the thing that will issue in a kind of mutual and sustaining joy, and that's the point.
One of the things that I've heard you say when you've spoken in public is you'll say to somebody, you are exactly what God had in mind when he made you. And I hear that statement, and I find it to be incredibly disarming and life-giving, and it must be as well to the people you say it to. I'm curious where you came up with that statement.
I can't remember, I think there's just, in the early days, it was clear that homies, had this kind of skewed view of who they were. So in the early days, I had endless stories of parables of homies who thought they weren't enough and that they were less than. And that was kind of the definitional thing with a homie. You know, he made me feel like I was less than. You know, they would say things like that. And I go, yeah, and then I found myself really quite genuinely, authentically, truly, deeply, oh my God, are you kidding me? If you were my son, I would have thought I won the lottery. And I have to admit that every time I've ever uttered that in one way or another to a gang member, I'm never fooling, you know? I'm not pretending. I always, because once you can see who somebody is, you go, wow, this person's remarkable. You know, even though in most cases they've all done egregious, horrible things, but you can, then there comes that moment when you can just see as God sees. And then you go, no, you're exactly right. The problem is that you don't know this. You know, you don't measure up to something. You don't know the truth of who you are. Once you see what God sees, what we see, then you can kind of go, okay. So there's this notion that they're bad and they need to become better people. And I go, no. This is the wrong language. Find the right grammar, which is, you know, you're exactly right. Now inhabit that truth. Become that truth. You know, you don't have to at all deny any piece of you. You know, it all works, it all fits, it all belongs. And once you can kind of embrace all that, including your wounds, then, you know, then we're talking.
I know a lot of faith leaders who struggle with the gap between what they say to others that's true and what they believe about themselves. Is that statement that you share with others, is that easy for you to believe for yourself, or is that a struggle too?
Well, I think you do get to a place where you just, you know, you accept what is about who you are and where you've been, and every piece of you. You know, if God loves us without measure and without regret, well, you know, try to live that as deeply as you can, where that truth is embraced. You know, you don't compartmentalize, and you don't. Like, you know, lately I've been thinking about, you know, sin, and it makes less and less sense the more you kind of, you know, Jesus sort of laid out all these kinds of ways of seeing, you know, from blindness to sight, from oppression to liberty, from illness to restoring to health. All these kinds of notions that are really rich, and he kind of laid them all out. You know, sin was one of them, and then we just embraced it. And I think it was a bad decision, you know, because we could have gone with something that was really more whole. And a little bit, once you know things, like, for example, once you know what epilepsy is, you can never believe again when Jesus, you know, heals the guy he says is possessed by a demon, when in fact he's having epileptic seizures. You know what I mean? It changed, you know, no disrespect to Jesus, but, you know, obviously got it wrong, as everybody in his time did. This guy isn't possessed by a demon. He has an illness. It's called epilepsy. Here's a pill, and that will control your seizures. So we know things, you know, and so you can take that to the nth degree. Once you know the ACE study, adverse childhood experiences, every, you know, there's a 10 kind of checklist, and, you know, horrible things that can happen to kids that kids are exposed to. I don't have one of those on my list. I can't identify a single thing that happened to me that would be considered an adverse childhood experience. But everyone who walks through my doors has a 9 or a 10. And the 10th one is sexual abuse, and that's a hard one for homies to acknowledge. So I always say 9 or 10, but certainly all 9, clearly, mental ill parent, drug addiction, violence, all these things that they were exposed to. So once you know that, doesn't that start to color how you see free will and sin? Well, of course it does. Once you know science, it does start to kind of say, well, okay, wait a minute. So there's a course that was just needed in my alma mater called Hate, and it's trying to address hate head on because of the spate of shootings in synagogues and white supremacists and all that kind of stuff. And I go, yeah, it'd probably be more sensible if you called the course Health. That somehow we're being drawn to. Nobody's ever met a racist who was mentally healthy. Never. You've never met one. Nor an anti-Semite or anybody who hates. If they're hating, this is not healthy. And they're not mentally healthy. But if you if you demonize them, then you've struck the high moral distance that separates us. And then you can say, I'm not that person, which is the opposite of kinship. Kinship is supposed to say, no, that is me. That is the other me. We belong to each other. So, I don't know. I think it's richer to invite people to home rather than change your bad behavior. Because behavior is a language anyway. It's an indicator. It's telling you something. What language is it speaking? So anyway, I think it's just an expansive way of seeing, and I wish we saw things that way. Anyway.
Yeah, I think if I'm hearing you right, I think you're saying it's more about sickness and healing than right and wrong or doing good or bad things. It's a holistic thing.
Well, I think the moral thing is kind of a moral. It doesn't have very much to do about morality. I mean, I never joined a gang, but I don't even have any one of those checklists of adverse childhood experiences. So does that make me morally superior that I didn't join a gang and I grew up in LA? Of course it doesn't make me morally superior. In fact, kind of the opposite. Yeah. I've never had to carry what these folks have had to carry. I stand in awe at what they have had to carry rather than in judgment at how they carried it. And that's important, I think.
I think it's a really good word.
Hey, Brendan Reed here, producer of this podcast. Hey, if you know of a college-age student or 20-something who really wants to explore what ministry is like, they should consider spending a year with us at Discovery Christian Church out here in the Front Range of Colorado. My experience with this residency was I wasn't just getting coffee. I actually got to be a part of the church staff, and that meant that I had a voice in meetings. I even got the opportunity to build a ministry from the ground up that Discovery did not have during my residency. And out here, we really try to reach intellectual skeptics as well as followers of Jesus, and we're very passionate about engaging the chronic needs of our city and the world around us. Residents spend a year with us, and they take a class that dives into the material of this podcast. They also take on leadership responsibility, and you come away with a tangible ministry experience to set yourself up for a career in vocational ministry. So as a resident, you get to choose a specialty. We have youth, children's, worship arts, communications, preaching and adult discipleship. We also have local and global outreach and executive pastor work. We do provide housing with a family, and we offer a small stipend. To apply, click the link in the show notes, or you can visit dc2.me, click the About tab, and choose our residency.
So, Father G, part of the goal of this podcast is to provide some pressure relief for faith leaders. And the way we do it is we ask our guests some questions about their own internal anxiety. So it strikes me, you're a Jesuit priest, you were trained, you end up working among people in a gang culture in East LA. That's a whole learning journey. But you've had this other learning journey of having to build an organization and lead an organization, which surely you were not equipped to do in seminary. So on an organizational level, when you're finding yourself not knowing what to do, you have to do something, you have to lead something, but you're not sure what to do. What happens inside you when you don't know what to do?
Well, it's handed so much over to people who do know what they're doing. I'm not the CEO of Homeboy anymore. I'm happy to say, and I have somebody quite capable, who knows how to, manage cash flow and budgets and all the things I don't know anything about. So I think humility is kind of a key, even in the state board, but certainly in the administration stage. The humble answer, the poor, what would help you, and the stance that's filled with hubris says, here's what your problem is. And so the more that you can kind of just say, I don't know anything about budgets, I'm not going to pretend I do. And I'm not even going to try to learn it. I'm going to, surround myself with people who I trust and who know this stuff and who I listen to. So I think that's kind of what is necessary, and to know what you know. And I'm confident in what I know, and I'm equally confident in the stuff I don't know. So I don't pretend to know stuff that I don't know. And I try to get that out there right away.
The next question is about anxiety and physiology. I believe anxiety starts in the body, and if you can notice it in your body, you can actually intervene. So it typically starts in either a spinning mind or a racing heart or a tightening gut. Would you be willing to share where it might start for you?
Probably my gut, I guess. I don't know. It's funny. I feel, I'm trying to identify times when I feel anxious, and, I'm an introvert, so there are things that I don't enjoy, It's funny, I just gave a talk in Greenwich, Connecticut, and they put me in a B&B, and I was thinking, this is the difference between an extrovert and an introvert. An extrovert would say, I love B&Bs. It's like living in somebody's home. And an introvert says, I hate B&Bs. It's like living in someone's home. And I was laughing at myself because I thought, yeah, you can put me in front of 20,000 people and I don't feel anxious. I feel kind of energized. But put me in a cocktail party before that talk, and I'm totally anxious, and I'm staring at my watch. When will this be over? So I think that's the difference of extrovert, introvert, maybe,
Yeah.
But, there's myself and a Jesuit in the house that I live, we always talk about, give us this day our daily bread. And so we always ask each other, so what's your daily bread today? And it's okay, you kind of identify, well, I dread, I have to go out and meet with this donor and somehow get him to give me money, So it's kind of an exercise where you can identify what your daily bread is.
Yeah.
And there's also a way to say, now this whole other thing, gives me life. And so you can kind of identify, doesn't mean you don't do the thing you dread. You got to do it. you know, you kind of knowing, this will be unpleasant, and I'll feel anxious about it, and I'll dread every moment of it, and then it'll be over. So, the more self-knowledge you have about it, the better, certainly.
Yeah. I think you're actually naming something powerful. That naming anxiety actually is partly what gives you power over it. So if you know that you're about to dread something, you dread it less.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And then, it doesn't catch you off guard. Yeah, and you accept the fact that this will be unpleasant. For the next hour, this will probably be unpleasant. And then sometimes, that wasn't so bad. That wasn't what I anticipated. Actually, it was okay.
Yeah. So in the studies of leadership anxiety, there's acute anxiety and chronic anxiety. Acute is actual danger or actual threat of danger that is short-term in duration. And then chronic anxiety would be a perceived threat of danger that's not actually danger. So, driving down the street and the car in front of you slams on the brakes and you think you're going to hit them, that's actual acute anxiety. But having to go meet with a donor and dreading it, that would be chronic anxiety because it's perceived. You're actually not as threatened as you think. And the challenge is our bodies don't tend to know the difference unless we train them. So with that very long introduction, you've kind of already hinted at it, but I'm going to try this question. What is something that you think you need in any given moment that you don't actually need? Like in my case, I often feel this need to be understood. If somebody misunderstands me, I tend to get anxious because I believe that I need to be understood to be okay. Does anything come to mind for you?
Well, I think the thing that I don't like and I'm working on, is I don't need to be defensive. I don't know. I said something. We were in the church, in where the hell I was in Indianapolis last week, and I really was careful. I watched myself, but during the Q&A period, I told a kind of a story which I think is sort of endlessly cute and charming, and people huge laugh, and a woman came up to me afterwards, and she was so offended that I would say this in a church, And when I had told that story during the Q&A, I said, Richard Rohr says that only the false self is ever offended by anything, and I think that's really quite true. But I've had people come up to me before and get in my face afterwards and express their disappointment in me for one reason or another. And I've probably been more defensive than I was with this woman, but I caught myself. At one point, I caught myself rather than get defensive, which I was starting to do. I said, I'm really sorry, and that's not my tendency. My tendency is all barrels aimed in defense, and I did half well on that. I think she left kind of feeling, it didn't resolve itself well. She kept tightening the knot, and I wasn't helping too much. But I do remember saying, okay, you were half okay on that one, because in midstream I caught myself where I could just reach over and touch her arm and say, I am so sorry if any way I just was offensive to you. Now, in my head, I think, first of all, God couldn't do two minutes about something like this. God is never offended by this, and why in the world would we be? How lucky are we that we have a God who doesn't get bent out of shape by stuff? That's just the truth of the God we have. But what's the point of winning the argument? So when you say, I have to be understood, no, I have to win the argument, and that's where I have to catch myself. I don't know if defensive is the right thing. I have to win the argument. And why do I have to win the argument anyway?
Yeah. No, that's very helpful. Okay, let's move our discussion to group anxiety, because anxiety is contagious the way people catch a cold. And I know in your work you've seen I would say the fatal result of group anxiety. But where have you seen anxiety be contagious in a group?
Well, we've had, moments historically in our 31 years when we out of money, and of course this is not manufactured or fake or in people's minds. It's we're running out of money. In fact, we had one moment where we had to lay off 300 people. So every once in a while we can get to this panic, anxious, scapegoating. Why are you bringing in more people when we can barely pay for the ones we have? And so that can spread. And that's not to say that it doesn't have some basis in something that's real. But we need to kind of put it in some kind of perspective. So,
Father G, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, especially at this early hour. Thanks for joining us today. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram from the handle Steve Cusswords. You can also go to stevecusswords.com for more resources.
This episode has been a production of Brendan Reed and Steve Cuss.